really enjoy the spirit of collegiality here, and I think a small group, the roundtable format, really lends itself well to that. And also just the inviting, the welcoming atmosphere for those of us who have not been part of the ongoing conversation. I appreciate the fact that there are those of you who come back year after year and engage and renew those relationships, and there was too little of that, I think, in our profession. Too little of that occurs at conferences. And so this, for me, was very refreshing, and also to be welcomed here as a humanist at a kind of a social scientist gig. That's nice as well. But what I'm going to present, I trust, is going to be directly applicable to the things that we've been talking about, conversing about for the last day and a half, but also to some of the themes that have been put into play this morning already. I am a writer. I am a writing teacher, and I am a writing teacher who writes with his students. And there aren't too many who do that, I'm finding. And so I want to eventually, by the time I get to the end of my talk, just share a little bit about my recent experience of doing that, and my hope to research this in a more systematic way going forward. One of the themes that we've touched on, by the way, I had a more formal presentation, but I kind of just adjusted that to index cards, actually. I took my formal and nothing up on screen, as you can see. That means I can just stop talking, and I don't have to keep talking just because I have 20 slides I haven't gotten to, right? But nonetheless, I hope this will be a good format just to kind of share my experience with you, but also to try to tailor-make my comments a little bit more to the themes that we've been engaging for the last day. And one of those themes that we've touched on that I think has really emerged very clearly is the idea that leadership in all of its forms is deeply and unavoidably political. And I find that very interesting. Obviously it's about power, it's a distribution of power. Who has it, who's keeping it, who's going to share, and under what circumstances. But related to that, and this is a theme that we touched on yesterday a little bit, is that because it's political, it's moral. And it's moral because it involves issues of justice and social equity and so on, and again, topics that we've, in a very real sense, have been engaging already today. Issues of basic human respect, even. And that's kind of, for me, where the empathy issue and topic comes in, and why I'm so interested in that, and trying to see how that can be potentially a game changer within a classroom setting. I'm again approaching this from the standpoint of writing, looking at the pedagogy of writing instruction, looking at, in a broader sense, literacy issues, which, Dan, you raised literacy issues in your talk yesterday, and I found that very interesting. And I hope then that my comments, coming from this background of writing pedagogy, literacy issues, will dovetail nicely with these broader themes, because composition studies, literacy studies, and then how that, in a very practical way, affects what we do in a composition classroom, has really been undergoing a systemic transformation in the last 20 to 30 years. And really paradigmatic shifts, I would say, in how we view what composition is all about and what the teaching of writing is all about. And we can really take and map those issues that are going on in composition studies right onto our discussion of leadership models. Several of you have presented the differences between transactional and transformational leadership. Donna, that's one of the things that you primarily were introducing into our discussion yesterday. The two types of approaching writing instruction in the broadest sense that I'm going to be talking about, by way of giving some background and context to you, as I said, maps directly, I believe, right onto that. Now, let me back up and tell you just a little bit about the transformation that composition studies has been undergoing, because it really just, it's the same story in many ways that you would find reproduced in probably every discipline that's represented here since the 1960s, which of course was a complete rethinking of the nature of higher education and the relationship between professors and students and everything, right? I mean, it's not just stuff that's going on out there in the political arena in the 1960s, it's directly impacting how we conceptualize our roles and then practically what we do as well. Deborah Brandt is an English professor at the University of Wisconsin who has been a real trailblazing leader in rethinking composition studies. Deborah Brandt in 2001 published a very notable book in this area called Literacy in American Lives. Literacy in American Lives. I mentioned her for a couple of reasons. This is a central work in this discipline. And of course, we all know those landmark works, right, in our own field. This is definitely one of those in the area of composition studies, Literacy in American Lives. I mention it as well because she's an English professor who basically did very hardcore sociological research. She conducted about 100 interviews, which resulted in oral histories, case studies of people's literacy narratives. She interviewed over the course of many years, as I said, 100 people, ranging in age from about 10 to 98. And so in a sense, spanning the entire 20th century. And so the title of her book, Literacy in American Lives, captures the richness and the texture of that. Her interest was to try to find out and determine from these living stories how people acquired literacy skills in that broadest sense of how we understand that term. And out of this, she distilled some very interesting and radical new ways of thinking about literacy and the instruction of literacy. She found, of course, that it's a very political thing, no surprise there, right? But she introduced this terminology into composition studies called literacy sponsorship. Anybody familiar with that term, the notion of talking about sponsors of literacy? I mean, this is a very important concept in composition studies, to be a sponsor of literacy. Every one of you is a sponsor of literacy, whether you knew that term or not. A sponsor of literacy is one who facilitates, who makes possible the acquisition of literacy skills in all of the sense. Teachers, obviously, are natural sponsors of literacy, but we're not the only sponsors of literacy. Parents are. Parents who read to their children are sponsors of literacy. Siblings sometimes are. In some contexts, businesses function that way. Churches, especially in the African American community, churches have played a traditional role as sponsors of literacy. Some fascinating work has been done historically looking at that. Businesses, corporations even. And the interesting thing is there's a give and a take, right? There's a, I'll do this for you, but you provide these business skills to me, and so on. So you begin to see the political dimension of this concept, how rich it is, and how it really does have to be looked at as a kind of sociological reality. And that literacy then is being reconceptualized and reimagined as a kind of natural resource within the economy of skills. And that's a fascinating way, and again, as I said, inextricably linked to political considerations and aspects of power, aspects, as I said, of justice. Well, as I said, some really good revisionist work has been done in looking at this, looking at the actual practical implications of how we do this, how we bring a full range of literacy skills to enable our students, to empower our students. For example, just to mention a couple of things, some really good work has been done in looking at literacy sponsorship as a precursor to the civil rights movement, and going back and looking at things such as the citizenship schools, if you're familiar with that, the citizenship schools in South Carolina. It's a rich history of that in the 1940s, 1950s, of schools that were sponsored as schools for African American children who didn't have access in the segregated South to the same opportunities. And this really was, as I said, a kind of forerunner and a precursor to what you begin to see then in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I was thinking, Dan, of your presentation yesterday in this concept of sponsorship of literacy sponsors, because you mentioned Indonesia. You mentioned the Dutch colonial influence in Indonesia. And one of the stories in particular there was a story of sponsorship. It was a story of sponsorship by a colonial power, by a foreign religious culture in missionary schools, Dutch Reform schools, and so on, and how there was the acquisition of literacy, the ability to learn to read and write in Dutch, for example, and just the interesting kinds of dynamic that entails. And so literacy sponsorship is a rich idea, it's a very important idea, and it's one that really challenges us to rethink what we do. Because, I mean, if I'm a sponsor of literacy, then whose values am I sponsoring? Is really, and again, that very taken by that Dutch-Indonesian example, right? I mean, the notion of, it's wonderful to teach people to read and write, but you're teaching them to read and write Dutch within a Dutch Christian context, and there's something very interesting about that, and you find somebody taking those tools of literacy, and I'll give you a a phrase here that's used often in the literature, especially in work that's done by African American scholars, and that is taking the master's tools and using them against the master. Now, you've heard that before, right? And that's used often in composition studies, and I see that with the example, again, that Dan used. You can see that as you look at literacy sponsorship leading up to and through and beyond the civil rights movement as well. And so, are we willing to do that? Because that's a pretty overwhelming kind of task to take on, right? I mean, we don't, you know, for all of our self-flattering conceptions of ourselves and how we want to empower and enable our students and so on, we don't give up power easily. We don't really like to enable our students to take the tools we give them and to turn them against our arguments. I mean, that just doesn't come natural to us to do that. And yet, really, that's where we start to you know, we have to look in the mirror here at a certain point, right? And not talk about the system over here or the bureaucracy over there, but to really interrogate ourselves and our own participation in these kinds of acts of literacy sponsorship. And that's really where I'm coming from, just to kind of put my cards on the table and to give you a sense of how I'm engaged in this issue and how I'm thinking about it. I'm really coming at this topic from the standpoint and the subject of this roundtable, from the standpoint that we are, as teachers, we're leaders in our classroom. And I think we have to embrace that reality and accept that reality and not shuffle the responsibility up to Associate Deans, Donna, and others up the chain of command, or to up to them, for example, to cite the Pogo thing again. We've got to bring that back to it's really us. So we are sponsors of literacy. You're a sponsor of literacy, every one of you, who has a classroom, who has students that you are responsible for. So it matters what we do and how we do it. You might say, well, okay, sure, but I'm not a teacher of writing. Yeah, you are, in a sense. You require literacy skills in one form or the other. Maybe it is in the sense of formal papers that you do require. And I'm challenge you in a moment to think about that and to engage what are you modeling in the process of those assignments? What are you modeling in terms of your expectations? And whose ideas and values and so on, as I said, are you sponsoring? So it directly affects what we do. Let me come back to what I said initially, and that is that what has gone on in the last 30 years in terms of defining composition studies can be mapped onto transactional and transformational leadership styles. I'm going to suggest what I mean by that. There are two competing grammars that have been postulated within the study of composition. Two competing grammars. Very easy to remember the term. No fancy academic terminology here. It's very easy to remember. They're called grammar A and grammar B. Okay? I like that. I love the stripped down simplicity of the jargon, right? Grammar A and grammar B. And I'm going to, please understand that when I use the word grammar here, I'm referring to the whole apparatus of literacy and rhetoric. All of the literacy skills, all of the critical thinking apparatus that is subsumed by that. We're not talking about, nouns, subjects agreeing with verbs. We're not talking about grammar at that level. Grammar is a more holistic term to refer to literacy gestures, literacy maneuvers. Grammar A and grammar B. Grammar A is what you were taught. Grammar A is probably what you modeled in your classroom. You may say, I love transformational leadership, but I teach and model transactional writing. I'm going to challenge you to think about whether or not that, in fact, is the case as we go through this, as I talk with you about this a little bit more. Well, I'm going to have to define what grammar A is and what grammar B is a little bit more. I'll use some phrases that I jotted down to try to capture the essence of that. Grammar A, and then I'm going to invite you to help me fill in some gaps here as well. Grammar A is rule enforcing. You can already see why I'm opting to, as I said, map it onto that whole transactional model. It's rule enforcing. It involves do's and don'ts with appropriate penalties for infractions. And everyone has their list, right? Every one of us has our pet peeves. We have the do's and don'ts that are subscribed to by convention, but then there are our own private grievances, right? And so we approach it then as a rule-enforcing kind of rhetoric. It's coercive. It demands compliance. Now, as we go through this, I hope that you're also going to be thinking about, well, yeah, but we have to have some of that. Okay, that's the tension. That's the reality, right? And I'm inviting us to think about that tension here. Okay, great if we could just throw all rules out and everything, and just, you know, we understand that this is the give and the take, and I think that's implicit in everything that we've been talking about. Is that if we had our druthers, this is if we could remake the world, this is how it would look, right? And yet we are. The great German philosopher, controversial philosopher Heidegger said that we are thrown into the world. That was his existential way of describing it. I love that. We just find ourselves in a time and a place, in a system of bureaucracy, and we're thrown into the world, right? And we deal with those realities. That was something that was, the documentary raised that issue very interestingly a few moments ago. It's coercive. It demands compliance. It's hierarchical. No question about that. That's again, strong transactional pull. It's a hierarchical way of thinking about writing. Why? It's governed by convention, it's governed by expectations, powerful expectations about what's right and what's wrong. It's governed by tradition. This is just how we do research papers. It's governed by governing bodies like the APA, or in the field of the humanities, the MLA, the Modern Language Association. It's governed by august publications like the Chicago Manual of Style. Or ones that are showing their age a little bit, Strunk and White's Elements of Style, if you're familiar with them. Okay. These are very powerful enforcers of grammar A thinking. It is bureaucratic, it's technocratic. We could add all that to the transactional list if we want to. Let me be a little more provocative and say it's also imperialistic and colonial. Now that's interesting. And that's where, again, I keep picking on Dan here, it's where I keep thinking of Indonesia right now and Dutch colonial influence as kind of my way of casting this issue. But we don't think of ourselves as colonizers. Maybe we should. Maybe I go into a classroom and seek to colonize in certain ways. Colonize my language, colonize my rhetorical gestures. Right? I have a class, let's say, I have a lot of African-American students. Am I colonizing them? With my phraseology, with my expectations, with my language, with my sense of grammar. I think that's where it really, to me, becomes a very, very real, practical kind of consideration that I at least need to start by. I think the starting point is to think about that and recognize that, and to understand that dynamic. Now, the reality is that working with that tension is always the more difficult thing, because, yeah, there are practical realities of living in a world that's governed by expectations and conventions, and we all get that, right? But you don't want to just blindly go along and not interrogate that, and not think about that, and critique that. I mean, we of all people should be the ones who do that, right? And so it's a little bit shaming to myself when I don't do that, because it should be the very essence of what I am as a teacher in the classroom. What you should get from my description of Grammar A is that it's anchored in classical rhetoric. It's thesis-driven. It's expository writing, all these terms that we're familiar with. It has a certain conception of writing as a product that's supposed to look a certain way and be packaged a certain way. And one of its clearest and most visible manifestations is in the 5-paragraph essay. You know that, right? That is grammar. That is Grammar A rhetoric, in a sense, right there. The 5-paragraph essay. That's why I was so confident a minute ago when I said you all learned that, and you probably all teach that. Okay? Let's brainstorm a little bit, because the first day of my composition classes, I asked my students to take out a piece of paper and to give me a list of do's and don'ts about writing. Now, I'm not going to ask you to just write this down. Maybe I should, right? Maybe I should just do Shakira's little thing here and just wave my hand. That's when we were all under a trance. That hand comes, the words you say. But I'm not going to do that. I think I can trust you guys too. I mean, the whole point, we know that the whole point of participation and interaction is to make me as the speaker look good, right? Make me as the teacher look good. Yeah. Yeah, I had an evaluation from my department chair just a week or so ago, and it just so happened, it was a great kid popped in unannounced, and the students were just talking up a storm. I was like, yeah, this is what it's all about. They're really making me look good today. No, I'm expecting that you'll be able to give me some do's and don'ts here. So quickly, what are some things that you just know that you do or you don't do? We can always come up with the don'ts much easier. What do you?
Don't use text language.
Oh my
Don't
gosh.
use textbook language.
No, not texting language.
Oh, texting.
Text talk.
Oh,
Text,
okay.
LOLBRD.
All right, don't use texting language. That's interesting, you know why? Because right there, that is a dividing point between grammar A thinking and grammar B thinking, hugely. And I've got some interesting things that I can say about that because, you know, our tendency, a very conservative tendency to say, writing skills, literacy skills are going to hell in a handbasket. And it's everything to do with social media, texting, and so on. I'm stepping back from that and saying, really? We're losing the ability to be nuanced and to know what we're doing and to use language. And the fact is, students are learning to do things intuitively and making up new rules of rhetoric that make a lot of sense when you look at them and analyze them. And I'm coming at this as a linguist, as a philologist by training. I'm looking at this maybe a little bit differently. But there's a fascinating thing, I don't want to get too sidetracked by this, that there's been some interesting research done, some articles that have been written about periods and punctuation, terminal punctuation in text messaging. They almost don't exist. And in fact, to such a point that if you put a period in a text at the end of a sentence or at the end of a statement or something, it's viewed as passive-aggressive. This is borne out by plenty of research, and younger people in our group, and older people in here are just kind of laughing. You know what I mean, right? You know, you put a period at the end of it, it's like, period. It's like, I'm making a point, that's what a period is a point, right? Instead of, see, social media interaction is very open-ended. That's the nature of it, right? And when you put a period in, you're doing this. That's passive-aggressive. And students intuit. I question my classes and say, yeah, exactly right. I question my 16-year-old daughter about this, exactly right, yeah. And it's like, wow, this is fascinating to me as a linguist because it is this is happening organically from the bottom up. New grammatical rules are emerging without the benefit of teachers. How about that? Right? Now that's unruly. That's unruly by definition. It doesn't follow Strunk and White. It doesn't follow, no. But this is what's happening intuitively and naturally, and I find that deeply fascinating. And so I hear this, don't use texting language, and so I'm thinking, again, as a linguist, why not? You know? And these lines are going to get blurred, and give it enough time, and these distinctions will break down.
Are we talking about the 5 paragraph?
Yeah, let's just talk about, when you have a writing assignment, let's say in class and so on, what are some of your do's and don'ts? Let's get some more answers.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of sort of a research answer. Yeah, some basic things you're going to capitalize and so on. What are some other things you shouldn't do? Yeah.
Oh, you shouldn't do?
Yeah, or that you should.
I was going to say that you should indent at the beginning of every
So the normal typographical features and so on. What about the writing itself? Yeah, Bryce?
You should limit your paragraph to probably one main idea and build around it rather than.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Shoveling
I mean,
every
that's such
idea.
grammar A thinking, right? I mean, one paragraph's got to hang around a single idea. Now, with a topic sentence, it's clearly formulated, right?
And a lead-in sentence at the end of the paragraph, a transitioning, thank you, transition sentence from one
Yeah, who made
paragraph
up
to
all
the
these
other.
rules? I mean, eventually you follow it back, it goes back to the ancient Greeks, it goes back to ancient Greek rhetoric. Yeah, but it's about as patriarchal as it can possibly be, this way of thinking. And it's deeply embedded. And we like to tell ourselves that it's just logical. That's what we tell ourselves, right? And yet there is a deep-coded history that lies behind these kinds of gestures that we engage in. Some more writing things. I mean, you know.
Is it difficult to read if you don't have 5 paragraphs and have one paragraph which is 16 pages?
Yeah, so the whole notion of
Yes,
paragraphs, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And I've
Breaking
had
it up.
students tell me you've got to have a certain number of sentences in a paragraph.
Yes.
Okay, really?
Yeah. Can't have
Number of
a,
sentences
yeah,
in a paragraph,
that's
right? So I
right.
read.
No one
That's
sentence
true.
paragraph.
Well, I don't think it's like you don't want to have
So you'd have a
20
problem if a student had this paragraph with 2 sentences in it?
Yes.
Or one sentence?
Yes, I would take one.
Okay, so the very
I
best.
was just gonna zero.
Because I love giving examples taken out of publications like the New Republic and the New Yorker and so on, the very best writers, and give them to my students and say, oh, gee, look how they're breaking all the rules. Look at this one sentence paragraph. And then I say, why did they break that rule? Now that's where some really interesting teaching happens, some learning. Why did they break that rule? Maybe they broke that rule, maybe there's a good reason behind it. And the reason might be, oh, that really makes a point when you see that one short emphatic
Stands out.
sentence all by itself. It's transitional, it drives the point home. Gee, could that have something to do with it? So maybe there is a purpose behind, there should be a purpose behind what we do when we write. That's what gets lost in a rule-based system. It's all about the rules. It's never about, you know, the effect that you're trying to create or what you're trying to communicate or how you can best and most strategically do that. It's, oh, I have to conform to this kind of grammar A list of do's and don'ts. What about starting sentences with and or but? Is that something that
And I do it all the
Oh,
time.
when I query my students, I get that one as a huge response, right? You can't do this. And I say, why have you been taught that?
It's
And they
more,
don't have
they're
a
a
clue.
lot more
They
flexible
don't
with
have a
that.
clue why they've been taught that. And then again, we have an opportunity to look at that, to look at
Yeah.
examples where every writer does
Right.
this,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Those kind of things are considered poetic license. You can do that.
I wouldn't even use the term poetic license. I would say what that is a myth that has a long history behind it that has just become ensconced in educational practice. That's what it is. Because we all love rules. It's easy to teach by rules, and it's easy to grade by rules. That's grammar A thinking again, right? Because now I don't really have to engage the content of what my student is saying. I can see whether commas are put in the right place. I can see whether he violated this rule or that rule. That's that whole transaction again, that exchange thing. And that's a way of thinking. So here's my point and my challenge to you. I started off being a little provocative, I think, by saying, you do grammar A things probably. That's my guess. Me too. We all do that to some extent, right? So we can, on the one hand, say, this is what my ideal is of what teaching and learning should be about. This is how I think that it should model a way of leading. But really, in these kinds of activities in the classroom, this is really what I'm doing. And it kind of, there's a dissonance there. And that's what I'm really trying to challenge you to think about, even as I have been reflecting upon this in my own practice. All right. I don't want to be too long here. Let me see here. I want to come back to the idea of imperialism and colonialism. Because you can look at, you can I think you can view as political. I don't think it's politicizing it. I think it's rightly viewing it as political when you view grammar A that way. For all the reasons I think they're already implicit in the examples that we just cited. That sense of colonizing another person's language with my own language. Colonizing somebody's expectations with my standards and my expectations. Such that we really model for them a kind of self-editing in terms of what they say. And how do you handle the dynamics of the reality of the world that we live in again, where we have conventions, we have expectations, it's on for a reason. That's the nature, we're social beings, right? And we operate within social structures that are bounded by convention. I don't have easy answers for that, but I know that it does start with reflection, and it also starts with conversation about these things. One of the things I do is I talk to my students about this. And right there, just by giving light to the subject and exposing the issues and the dynamics and the realities, And what I tell my students, I try to teach them different ways of writing, grammar B types of writing. But then I always say in the very same breath, but always follow the house style. And that's my tip. If you find yourself in a classroom with a teacher who says, don't start sentences with and or but, then guess what? You want a good grade? Don't start sentences with and or but. Follow the house style. You find yourself in a corporate setting, a business setting, where they expect you to do things a certain way. And they're not going to reward your creativity and your grammar B writing. Follow the house style. I mean, there's a kind of, I think, social logic to that we are stewards in the classroom. We have a responsibility in looking out for the long-range, multifaceted interests of our students, don't we? But engaging it as a matter of conversation is a huge step forward so that they understand that dynamic, they understand that political dimension of what we do when we engage these kinds of rules. Oh, I was going to give you a couple of really interesting examples here, but I don't know that I want to take. I'm going to give you one example of grammar A thinking, its pervasiveness. I was going to go all the way back to ancient Babylon, and a fascinating tablet